Well, good evening, everyone from Prior Lake. I just wanted to kind of get back in touch with you and to actually give you some preliminary information about tomorrow's class. And so we're going to be reflecting upon, and which I want to be you to reading on, is Paul's letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, which is, as if you've read the Gerald Collins article, you will understand this is one of the first primary testimonies of Jesus's resurrection, coming from the year around 54. We know the Gospels, for example, the Gospel of Mark is not written until the 60s, Matthew and Luke probably in the 70s and 80s, and John possibly around the 90s. So this is the first testimony we have. And Paul is dealing with a number of different issues in 1 Corinthians. He's dealing with issues of Eucharist, about charity, about various other factors, but he comes to this chapter 15, and it's really talking about this issue of somehow or another there's a problem in that community dealing with the resurrection, and there's great speculation about this. Did they believe, these people believe sort of like a more of a spiritual type of resurrection with no bodily resurrection? And this is what Paul is going to be arguing. But the first part is, the first 18 chapters is, our first 18 verses is what I really want you to focus on, but then to read the entire text. And so in this context, what Paul is saying is he begins by saying that he is now preaching the good news, and the good news meaning, of course, the gospel, meaning that this is the good news that Jesus has been raised from the dead. Not only has he died on the cross, which I hope you've reflected on Wednesday, but also that he has raised from the dead. And so therefore, what he himself has received this message and he's passing it on. And that's what we mean by tradition. Tradition means the act of receiving it and passing it on, which he is doing. As Gerald Collins talks about, he is probably picking this up from various other traditions in various communities in the Mediterranean. But anyway, so then he is saying this, that he is passing on this living tradition, where he is now embodying, but also that in this context, this is the message in which you are being saved. This is it. And he really stresses this later on, even in the text, in this chapter, but he's saying that basically that without the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, our faith is meaningless. He does not say that any other thing about any other place of the incarnation of Jesus, about his passion, death, crucifixion, so forth. He does not say this about this resurrection. And so we have these preliminary things that we're looking at, this living tradition in which he stands, in which he is now passing on us, in which he is asking the believers to stand on that also. This is meaning that this is what we hold to, this is our foundation, and so forth. And so what he's passing on are these four faith statements that Gerald Collins goes through. I'm just going to give you a quick summary of those things, one of which he died for our sins according to scriptures. He was buried. He was raised from the dead on the third day, and he appeared. And so these are these faith statements that he is saying, and we believe that he was receiving this from an early creed, giving us what we call the kerygma meaning core teaching. So this is what essentially we have to believe, if you're going to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, is he did die, he was buried, and he meant really dead, and he was raised on the third day. That would be Easter Sunday, and he appeared. And so in the context of what Gerald Collins does in his article, is explicates those sorts of things, that he truly did. He did die, and he was buried. And so the Gospels proclaim this in terms of what we call the empty tomb traditions, where Jesus himself was in the tomb from Friday, presumably from the early evening of Friday to Sunday morning. And then, therefore, since he has died, he has been raised, and he has been raised from the dead on the third day. And of course, this is, Gerald Collins gets in this issue of the third day, because the belief is that the soul kind of hung around the body till about 3 days, and then it left. Well, this is the idea here, is that this is not simply a spirit rising, but this is Jesus's bodily rising from the dead. And so on the third day, he is rising from the dead, and then he is then appearing. And this is where some of the controversies come in here, that Jesus is talking about this thing in terms of that he is appearing to all of these various other people here. He is appearing to Peter, to the 12, to the 500, to James and the apostles, and Paul. And if you've read the Gospel of Luke, you'll understand one of the persons that is missing from this list is Mary Magdalene. And as I've mentioned before, she is one I'm working on, and without her, she is the primary testimony, primary witness to the resurrection of Christ according to the Gospels. Without her being what she's called the apostle of apostles, without her, then the testimony is very weak. But I don't want to get into the issue of Mary Magdalene here. But he's listing all these people that Jesus appeared to, and these appearances are very important because Jesus is appearing to them and they're having a real experience. And as you've read, that he is talking about this thing in terms of that this is a real experience for them. And therefore, and this is what Gerald Collins is going to emphasize in that article that you were to read about the various ways in which he appeared, but they are receiving these things as a real experience, and then they're passing them on, and they become testimonies to that. And then Paul says, lastly, because there's this whole question about whether he's an apostle or not. He himself is an apostle because he has received this appearance, a very different appearance, much later than these, past the 40-day period in which this is happening. Remember, when Jesus raises from the tomb on Easter Sunday, there's 40 days later, according to Luke's gospel, where then he ascends to heaven and he never comes down again, and yet he appears in this voice to Paul when he's on his way to Damascus. And hopefully we'll have time in a few weeks to deal with Paul. So then he goes on after those 4 faith statements, then he goes on to talk about basically what it comes down to is without the resurrection of Jesus, our faith is meaningless, our faith is in vain, and so forth. And so this is what he believes that we are standing on. That is, we are standing on this resurrection of Jesus, and we ourselves are going to be raised. So the rest of chapter 15 is actually speaking about that reality of Jesus himself, who has now been raised to dead, and then that energy, that spiritual transformation that Jesus himself will be sharing us. And what Paul's struggling to describe in human language is, how is it possible that we who are spiritual beings, but also made of matter, how is it that we are going to be raised from the dead? And so he is trying to describe this reality in which we will join Jesus in the general resurrection of the dead. He is what Paul says, the first fruits. And so at the end of time, we will all raised up to be like Jesus. And that is the central message that I wanted to get across today. So read the article of Gerald Collins, and if you have any questions, please raise these issues in the discussion, okay? Have a blessed spring break, and I hope you get much out of reading 1 Corinthians 15 and also the accompanying literature that goes on. Good night. Ciao. Buona notte.